When single mom Christina Harris fell behind on rent during tough times, her ruthless landlord, Robert Lynch, tried to evict her and demanded $10,000 for fake damages. Lynch wasn't just greedy. He had a history of exploiting tenants and breaking the law for profit. But Christina, armed with evidence and unshakable determination, turned the tables in a courtroom showdown. Just wait until you hear how justice was finally served, and this mother's fight inspired a movement. Christina Harris never planned to become a single mother, but when her marriage fell apart, she knew she had to fight for the future of her 8-year-old daughter, Emma. Every morning, she would kiss her little girl on the forehead, sip on a cheap cup of coffee, and whisper to herself, "You've got this." Her life had become a delicate balancing act of work, parenting, and simply surviving. After weeks of searching for affordable housing, Christina finally stumbled upon an apartment listing that seemed like a miracle. The landlord, Mr. Robert Lynch, appeared warm and understanding, a silver-haired man with a soft smile who assured her he understood how hard it was for families these days. For Christina, it felt like a sign that things might finally start to stabilize. The apartment itself was modest but cozy. Christina painted the walls a calming light blue, bought secondhand furniture, and adorned Emma's room with colorful posters of her favorite animated characters. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. But beneath Lynch's affable exterior lay a far greedier and more ruthless man. At first, Lynch's behavior was merely irritating. He would drop by unannounced, claiming to check on the property, but his visits always carried an undercurrent of judgment. He'd comment on how she should take better care of the place, or remind her how lucky she was to live there. Neighbors warned her that Lynch had a reputation for being difficult. He liked control, and he liked his tenants vulnerable. Christina tried to ignore these red flags, convincing herself that as long as she paid her rent on time, everything would be fine. Then the economy took a nosedive, and Christina's world fell apart again. As a library assistant, her hours were reduced drastically. Her already tight budget became impossible to manage. She juggled overdue bills, groceries, and school supplies for Emma. One particularly harsh winter, Emma caught a nasty cold, and Christina had to make a heartbreaking choice: pay rent or buy the medication her daughter desperately needed. She chose her daughter's health. With a heavy heart, Christina approached Lynch to explain her situation. She was transparent, apologetic, and hopeful he might show her some compassion. She promised to make up the missed payment as soon as she could. Lynch listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he said flatly, "I'm not running a charity. If you can't pay, you need to leave." Days later, Christina received a court notice. Lynch had filed a lawsuit against her for non-payment of rent, demanding immediate eviction and an additional $10,000 in damages for property destruction. The claim was utterly false. Christina had taken meticulous care of the apartment, treating it as her sanctuary. In the courtroom, Lynch presented himself as the wronged party. With his expensive lawyer by his side, he spoke with exaggerated conviction, describing Christina as a careless tenant who had left his property in ruins. His lawyer echoed these sentiments, claiming, "This is about principles. Mr. Lynch has every right to protect his property from irresponsible renters." Christina sat quietly, holding Emma's hand tightly as Lynch continued his tirade. Her stomach churned as he pointed fingers and painted her as a villain. But the moment that stunned the entire courtroom was when Lynch smugly declared, "I'm doing this on principle. People like her shouldn't think that they can get away with anything." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the audience. Whispers of disbelief and outrage grew louder as people exchanged glances. Lynch seemed unfazed by the reaction, his smugness unwavering. To him, this was just another victory in a long line of battles he had won against tenants who couldn't fight back. But Christina wasn't like the others. She might have been shaken, but she wasn't broken. She knew there was more to Lynch's story, and soon the truth about his greed would come to light. Christina sat at her kitchen table late one night, staring at a pile of bills and court documents with tears streaming down her face. The once warm apartment felt cold and suffocating, and the weight of the world pressed heavily on her chest. She had tried so hard to shield Emma from the chaos, but her daughter was old enough to sense that something was deeply wrong. "Mommy, why are we losing our home? Did we do something bad?" Emma had asked earlier that day, her innocent voice cutting through Christina like a knife. Christina had no answer. How could she explain to an 8-year-old that the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes bad things happened, even when you tried your best? Instead, she had hugged Emma tightly and whispered, "I'll fix it, sweetheart. I promise." But as the days wore on, even she began to doubt her ability to keep that promise. Her savings were gone. She had already sold most of their belongings, the old TV, her wedding ring, and even Emma's bike, to cover mounting legal fees. During the day, she worked her regular job at the library, and at night, she picked up shifts cleaning offices in a nearby building. Exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, but she refused to let herself stop. If she stopped, they would lose everything. One evening, as Christina trudged home after a particularly grueling shift, her elderly neighbor, Margaret, called out to her from her porch. Margaret was a sharp and kind woman who had lived in the building for over 30 years, and she had seen her fair share of tenants come and go. "Come in for a cup of tea, dear," she said softly, sensing Christina's despair. As they sat in Margaret's cozy living room, Christina finally broke down. She poured out the whole story, the lawsuit, the threats, and the unbearable fear of losing the only home she could afford. Margaret listened intently, her expression shifting from sympathy to a steely determination. "I've seen Lynch pull this stunt before," Margaret said firmly, leaning forward. "You're not the first tenant he's tried to ruin. He's been doing this for years, squeezing people out so he can hike up the rent and bring in someone who'll pay more. He thinks no one will fight back." Christina's eyes widened. "Are you sure? I mean, I know he's cruel, but how can he get away with this?" Margaret gave a bitter laugh. "He's smart. He knows how to cover his tracks, and he has friends in the right places. But that doesn't mean he's invincible. You deserve the truth, and I'll help you find it." The next day, Margaret and Christina began their quiet investigation. Margaret, who had a knack for digging through public records, taught Christina how to search municipal archives. Together, they pored over old leases, eviction notices, and building permits. They found patterns, suspiciously similar claims of property damage in eviction filings, abrupt rent hikes, and discrepancies in how Lynch reported his income to the city. Their research also uncovered a string of complaints from former tenants, most of whom had been forced to leave under dubious circumstances. One woman claimed Lynch had shut off her utilities during a dispute. Another family reported being harassed until they had no choice but to move. The deeper they dug, the more obvious it became. Lynch wasn't just a greedy landlord. He was a calculated manipulator who exploited the system to line his pockets. But Christina knew that uncovering the truth wasn't enough. They needed proof. Lynch had connections in local government, and any evidence they presented would need to be airtight. As the puzzle pieces began to come together, Christina felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely powerless. With Margaret's help and the strength of her own resolve, she realized she might just have a chance to fight back. The courtroom buzzed as Christina Harris took her seat, clutching her attorney's reassuring glance. Across the aisle sat Robert Lynch, his smug demeanor radiating confidence. For weeks, Christina had been drowning in fear, but today, armed with hard-won evidence, she felt a glimmer of hope. Lynch's lawyer was the first to speak, weaving a narrative of his client as a kind-hearted landlord taken advantage of by a negligent tenant. Christina forced herself to sit still as the lies poured out. Mrs. Harris owes my client not just rent but damages," the lawyer concluded, flashing a practiced smile. Then came Daniel Price, Christina's young attorney, calm but commanding. "Your Honor, this case is not about unpaid rent. It's about Mr. Lynch's pattern of exploiting tenants and violating housing laws for profit." The room hushed. Daniel presented financial records showing Lynch had received government subsidies for low-income housing while charging full rent, pocketing both. He also provided eviction notices from 3 other tenants, each citing fabricated property damage. Judge Phillips raised an eyebrow, reviewing the documents. "Mr. Lynch, how do you explain collecting subsidies meant for affordable housing while overcharging your tenants?" Lynch shifted uncomfortably. "There must be a mistake. My accountant handles all that." The judge's voice sharpened. "And the unlawful eviction complaints? Are those mistakes too?" Lynch stammered, unable to mask his unease. The courtroom murmured as his arrogance cracked. Judge Phillips turned to Christina. "Mrs. Harris, I'd like to hear from you." Christina stood, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Your Honor, I've worked tirelessly to provide for my daughter. Losing hours at my job was devastating, but I didn't damage the apartment. I made it our home. When I couldn't pay on time, I hoped Mr. Lynch might show understanding. Instead, he chose to intimidate me, just as he's done to others. I'm standing here today, not just for myself, but for every family he's hurt." The room erupted in quiet murmurs of approval. Lynch's face turned pale, his once confident smirk gone. Judge Phillips looked thoughtful. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris." His gaze shifted back to Lynch, whose silence spoke louder than his earlier bluster. For the first time in weeks, Christina felt not just hopeful, but powerful. Justice, long overdue, was finally within reach. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Phillips delivered his verdict. "The case against Mrs. Harris is dismissed. The plaintiff's claims are without merit." For a moment, there was only silence, as if no one could fully absorb the words. Then, a ripple of applause broke out among the spectators, growing louder as people exchanged nods and smiles. Judge Phillips raised his gavel, regaining the room's attention. Additionally, evidence presented during this case reveals serious allegations of tax evasion and housing violations by Mr. Lynch. These matters will be referred for further investigation. Across the room, Robert Lynch sat motionless, his face pale and drawn. The confidence he'd displayed throughout the trial was gone, replaced by a blank stare. His lawyer busied himself with papers, avoiding eye contact, while whispers spread like wildfire. The mighty landlord, once untouchable, had been exposed for what he truly was. For Christina, the victory felt surreal. She had entered the courtroom that morning with fear in her heart, but now relief and pride swelled within her. She had done what seemed impossible. She had stood up to someone who thrived on intimidation and greed. As she exited the courthouse, the scene outside was electric. Journalists crowded around her, cameras flashing and microphones thrust in her direction. "Mrs. Harris, how do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter called out. Christina paused, holding Emma's hand tightly. Her daughter looked up at her, beaming with pride. Christina drew in a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. "This isn't just my victory. This is a victory for every family, every mother who's ever been afraid to stand up for what's right. We don't have to stay silent. We have the power to fight for justice." Emma smiled, her small hand clutching her mother's. For Christina, this was the most important moment of all, showing her daughter the value of courage and resilience, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of Christina Harris spread quickly. Local headlines declared, "Single mom brings down greedy landlord," and "Justice served, how one woman took on the system." Her story inspired others to speak out, encouraging tenants to organize, file complaints, and demand accountability from landlords who abuse their power. Meanwhile, Robert Lynch's name became synonymous with greed and corruption. Further investigations revealed years of tax fraud, unlawful evictions, and subsidy schemes that lined his pockets. His properties were seized, and he faced legal battles on multiple fronts, including the possibility of prison time. For Christina, life slowly returned to normal. She resumed her job at the library, savoring the peace that had once seemed so distant. Weekends were spent at the park with Emma, reading stories before bedtime and creating new memories in the home they had fought to protect. Her story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, one voice could spark change. As she watched Emma play, laughter ringing out in the warm afternoon sun, Christina felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Justice had prevailed, and their future was brighter than ever.